German naval captain Karl Conrad Mecke stood on the deck of HMS Campbeltown, admiring British engineering. The destroyer had rammed into the St. Nazaire dock gates the night before, a suicide mission, clearly. But the ship was still intact. It could probably be salvaged. Around him, 40 German officers and civilians toured the wrecked vessel. Some examined the damage to the bow. Others peered into compartments, searching for intelligence documents. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that they were standing on top of 4.5 tons of high explosives. And the timer had already run out. The explosion, when it came, was heard 15 miles away. The blast vaporized the entire front half of the destroyer. It demolished the 160-ton steel gate of the dry dock. A wall of water swept through the harbor, carrying the remains of the ship into the ruined dock. All 40 men on board were killed instantly. Another 320 Germans in the surrounding area died in the explosion or drowned in the flood. The Normandie dry dock, the only facility in German-occupied France that could service the battleship Tirpitz, was destroyed. It wouldn't be repaired until 1948, 3 years after the war ended. This is the story of how a crew of 611 British sailors and commandos turned an obsolete American destroyer into a floating bomb, sailed at 400 miles into the heart of German-occupied France, and pulled off what Winston Churchill called the greatest raid of all. But here's the thing about the greatest raid. Almost everyone involved knew they weren't coming home. To understand why the British were willing to sacrifice hundreds of men to blow up a single dry dock, you need to understand one ship. The Tirpitz, Germany's largest battleship, 42,000 tons of steel, 8 15-inch guns that could hurl a shell the weight of a small car over 20 miles, armored so heavily that conventional bombs bounced off her deck. By early 1942, the Tirpitz was anchored in Trondheim, Norway, a constant threat to Allied convoys crossing the Atlantic. She didn't even have to leave port to be deadly. Just her existence tied down massive British naval resources. Every convoy needed battleship escorts, just in case the Tirpitz decided to sortie. But there was a problem. The Tirpitz was too big. If she were damaged in the Atlantic, there was only one dry dock on the entire European coast large enough to repair her, the Normandie Dock at St. Nazaire, France. The dock had been built in 1928 to service the massive French ocean liner Normandie, one of the largest ships ever constructed. It was 350 meters long, 50 meters wide, and could hold vessels displacing 85,000 tons. Perfect for the Tirpitz. In early 1942, British intelligence learned that Germany was planning to move the Tirpitz to St. Nazaire. Once there, she would be perfectly positioned to raid Atlantic convoys. The losses would be catastrophic. Prime Minister Winston Churchill called a meeting. The message was clear. Destroy the Normandie Dock, and you eliminate the Tirpitz as a threat. Without that dry dock, she'd have to stay in Norwegian waters or risk the North Sea if damaged. Either option severely limited her effectiveness. But there was a problem. St. Nazaire was 400 miles from the nearest British port. The harbor was heavily defended, 6,000 German troops, 43 artillery pieces, countless machine gun nests, searchlights, anti-aircraft batteries. The port entrance was protected by anti-torpedo nets. The harbor was studded with obstacles, and the dock gates themselves were massive steel structures weighing 160 tons each. Bombing wouldn't work. RAF raids had proven the dock gates were too heavily built to destroy from the air. A conventional naval assault was suicide. No British warship could get close enough without being blown out of the water. Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, looked at the problem and came to a radical conclusion. If you couldn't bomb the dock and you couldn't shell the dock, there was only one option left: ram it, with a ship packed full of explosives. The ship they chose was HMS Campbeltown, originally USS Buchanan, a relic from World War I. She was one of 50 obsolete American destroyers transferred to Britain in 1940 as part of the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. 4 stacks, thin armor, barely seaworthy. The Royal Navy had planned to scrap her within the year. Now she was about to become the most important ship in the fleet. Lieutenant Nigel Tibbets, a 28-year-old explosives expert, was given a simple assignment: turn the Campbeltown into a floating bomb powerful enough to destroy a steel gate that weighed more than the ship itself. His solution was elegant and terrifying. 24 Mark 7 depth charges, each containing 180 kilograms of Amatol high explosive, were cemented together in steel tanks and hidden in the bow of the ship directly behind the forward gun mount. Total payload: 4.5 tons of explosives. The charges would be detonated by 3 pencil fuses, acid-activated timers that would trigger 8 to 10 hours after being set. The fuses were connected by cord-tex and cemented into place so they couldn't be tampered with. The beauty of the design was its simplicity. Once the fuses were activated before departure, nothing could stop the explosion, not discovery, not defusal, not capture. The Campbeltown would explode whether the Germans found the charges or not. To prepare the ship for her final mission, she underwent radical modifications. 2 of her 4 smokestacks were removed to make her silhouette resemble a German Muwa-class torpedo boat. All unnecessary weight was stripped out to reduce her draft so she could cross the shallow Loire estuary. Extra armor plating was welded to her bow to protect the explosives and give her ramming power. Her crew was reduced to 75 men, just enough to sail her to target. 12 20mm Oerlikon guns were added to fight her way into the harbor. The plan was audacious to the point of madness. The Campbeltown, accompanied by 16 motor launches carrying commandos, would sail 400 miles across the English Channel and up the Loire estuary. They would approach St. Nazaire under cover of darkness, flying German flags and using captured German identification codes. When challenged, they would pretend to be German ships as long as possible. When the ruse was discovered, they would fight their way into the harbor. The Campbeltown would ram the dock gates at maximum speed, 19 knots, driving her bow deep into the structure. Commandos would disembark and destroy the dock's operating machinery, while naval crews sabotaged everything they could reach. Then they would evacuate on the motor launches and pray some of them made it home. Oh, and one more thing. The Campbeltown's crew wasn't told about the explosives until they were at sea. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty, the ship's captain, was informed of the suicide nature of the mission. He accepted immediately. When asked if he thought they'd survive, Beatty replied, "I give us a 50-50 chance of getting in, about even money on getting out, and 0 chance of bringing the Campbeltown home." He volunteered anyway. So did his entire crew. The flotilla left Falmouth on the afternoon of March 26, 1942. 21 vessels, the Campbeltown, 16 motor launches, 1 motor torpedo boat, 1 motor gunboat, and 2 Hunt-class destroyers as escorts. 611 men. They sailed south, forming a convoy that looked, from a distance, like a German mine-laying operation or a patrol group heading toward Gibraltar. Deception was everything. The crossing was uneventful until they encountered a German U-boat 200 kilometers west of St. Nazaire. One of the escort destroyers gave chase but failed to sink it. The U-boat radioed an alert, but its captain sent an incorrect heading, reinforcing the British deception that they were heading further south. Pure luck. They encountered French fishing trawlers next. Both crews were taken off, and the boat sunk. The British couldn't risk them reporting the convoy's true heading. At 10 p.m. on March 27th, the convoy received a signal. RAF Bomber Command was beginning its diversionary raid on St. Nazaire. The German anti-aircraft batteries opened up. Searchlights swept the sky. The city's defenders were focused upward, exactly as planned. But Captain Karl Conrad Mecke, commander of the 22nd Naval Flak Brigade, was suspicious. The bombers were dropping their loads one at a time instead of in concentrated runs. It felt wrong. He ordered his gun crews to remain vigilant even after the bombers departed. At 1:20 a.m. on March 28th, German searchlights snapped on. A lookout had spotted suspicious vessels in the Loire estuary. The flotilla was 2 miles from the dock gates. A German signal light flashed, "Identify yourself." The Campbeltown, flying a German naval ensign and using captured identification codes, transmitted a response. Damaged German. Ships returning to port after engagement with British forces. The Germans hesitated. The identification code was valid. But something felt wrong. The ships kept coming. 1 mile from the target. Another signal. "Identify yourself again." Another delay while the German response was transmitted and verified. Half a mile. Mecca made his decision. Those weren't German ships. Every searchlight in the harbor blazed to life. 43 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The Campbeltown dropped her German flag and raised the white ensign of the Royal Navy. The motor launches carrying commandos were devastated. Wooden hulls offered no protection against German shells. Some burst into flames immediately. Others were torn apart by direct hits. Men leaped into the freezing water, some burning, some drowning, some cut down by machine gun fire before they could swim to shore. Of the 16 motor launches that entered the harbor, only 4 would escape. But the Campbeltown kept coming. Her 20-millimeter guns hammered away at German positions. Shells ripped through her superstructure. Men died at their posts. The ship shuddered under the impacts, but her engines never faltered. Lieutenant Commander Beatty stood on the bridge, conning the ship through sheets of German fire, steering for the massive shadow of the dock gates. 300 yards. 200. 100. The Campbeltown ripped through the anti-torpedo net. At 1:34 a.m., traveling at 19 knots, she slammed into the steel gate. The impact was catastrophic. The bow crumpled. Metal screamed. The ship's momentum drove 9 meters of her forward section up onto the gate structure, leaving her forecastle hanging above the entrance. Beatty calmly announced to his crew, "Well, here we are, 4 minutes late." The commandos who'd survived the approach were already scrambling over the sides. What happened next was chaos wrapped in heroism, wrapped in blood. Commando teams, led by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman, raced through the port complex. They were heavily armed with Thompson submachine guns, Bren guns, mortars, and rucksacks containing up to 90 pounds of explosives each. Their targets: the pumping station that controlled the dock, the winding houses that operated the gates, the bridges that connected different areas of the port, the submarine pens, the power station, every piece of infrastructure that made the dock functional. They moved through the darkness using blue flashlights and equipment straps painted with reflective white. Their password was War Weapons Week. The response, Weymouth, chosen because Germans would stumble on the pronunciation of the W. One team, led by Captain Donald Roy, wearing his regimental kilt, fought their way to the winding houses and planted charges. Another secured the submarine locks. A third defended the evacuation point at the Old Mole, where the motor launches were supposed to pick up survivors. But the evacuation was falling apart. Of the 16 motor launches, most were burning wrecks. German fire had been withering. Only a handful were still seaworthy, and they were frantically evacuating wounded men under continued shelling. The commandos fought for 2 hours, accomplishing nearly every objective despite overwhelming German resistance. But when the evacuation time came, most of the boats were gone. The surviving commandos, over 200 men, were stranded. They fought their way inland, trying to reach the countryside and escape overland. Some made it to safe houses. A handful eventually reached Spain and then Gibraltar. Most were captured. Sergeant Thomas Durant manned a Lewis machine gun on one of the motor launches, fully exposed to German fire. He was wounded repeatedly, in the chest, arms, legs. His commander begged him to take cover, Durant refused. He kept firing until he physically couldn't pull the trigger anymore. He died of his wounds in German custody. His Victoria Cross citation was recommended by the German officer who captured his position, Korvettenkapitän Friedrich Rabe, who was so impressed by Durant's courage that he submitted the recommendation through official channels. By dawn, the raid was over. The port complex was wrecked, but most of the raiders were dead or captured. The Campbeltown sat wedged on the dock gates, her bow crumpled, her decks littered with shell casings and blood. The Germans assumed the raid was over. They began assessing the damage. Captain Meka and his staff toured the destroyer, examining the wreckage. Surely this antique ship could be salvaged. Perhaps they could even repair her and put her back in service. Engineers examined the bow. Intelligence officers searched for documents. 40 senior officers and civilians gathered on deck to discuss the ship's fate. No one noticed that the clock was still ticking. The pencil fuses had been activated before the Campbeltown left England. They were set for an 8-hour delay. The ship had rammed the dock at 1:34 a.m. 8 hours later would be 9:34 a.m. But something had gone wrong with the detonators. Perhaps the acid had been affected by the cold. Perhaps the impact had damaged the mechanism. Perhaps it was simply the chaos of battlefield engineering. The fuses didn't trigger at 9:30 or 10 Schuss. The Germans relaxed. The ship was clearly safe. The British hadn't been clever enough to booby-trap it. At 10:30 a.m., the fuses finally activated. 40 men were standing on the Campbeltown's deck when 4.5 tons of explosives detonated. The blast was heard in Nantes, 15 miles away. The entire forward section of the destroyer, everything ahead of the bridge, simply vaporized. A mushroom cloud of smoke, fire, and debris rose hundreds of feet into the air. Windows shattered across St. Nazaire. The ground shook like an earthquake. The 160-ton steel caisson that formed the dock gate was ripped from its moorings and blasted into fragments. A 30-foot wall of water surged through the breached entrance, flooding the dry dock and sweeping the remains of the Campbeltown into the ruined basin. All 40 Germans on the ship were killed instantly, vaporized, drowned, or crushed by collapsing structures. Another 280 Germans in the surrounding area died in the blast or the flooding. The Normandie Dock was annihilated. The gates were destroyed. The operating machinery was wrecked. The pumping station was in ruins. And the Germans panicked. That evening at 9:30 p.m., 2 more massive explosions rocked the port. The delayed action torpedoes that the British motor torpedo boat had fired during the raid finally detonated at the submarine basin entrance. The Germans, convinced they were under a second attack, opened fire indiscriminately. French civilians were shot. German soldiers fired on each other in the chaos. 16 French civilians were killed. 30 more were wounded. In the aftermath, 1,500 French civilians were arrested and interned in a camp. Most of their houses were demolished as collective punishment, even though they'd had nothing to do with the raid. The human cost was staggering. British casualties: 169 killed, 105 sailors, 64 commandos, 215 captured, many wounded. 5 commandos escaped overland to Spain and Gibraltar. Only 228 of 601 men made it home, German casualties. Over 360 dead, including the 40 on the Campbeltown and 320 in the surrounding area, hundreds wounded. The port of St. Nazaire rendered unusable for major warships, but the strategic impact was even greater. The Tirpitz never entered the Atlantic. Without the Normandie Dock, Germany couldn't risk deploying her where she might be damaged. She remained in Norwegian waters, tied down by British forces, until she was finally sunk by RAF bombers in November 1944. The raid earned 89 decorations for bravery, including 5 Victoria Crosses, more VCs awarded for a single action than any other engagement in World War II. After the war, St. Nazaire became one of 38 battle honors awarded to the British commandos. The Normandie Dock wasn't repaired until 1947. It didn't return to full service until 1948, 3 years after the war ended. All because 601 men sailed an obsolete destroyer packed with explosives into the heart of German-occupied France and turned their ship into a bomb. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty, captured after the raid, later received the Victoria Cross. His citation was read by the German officer who interrogated him, another enemy so impressed by British courage that he recommended the decoration himself. When asked after the war why he volunteered for a mission with such low odds of survival, Beatty replied simply, "Someone had to do it. The Tirpitz had to be stopped, and we were expendable. The Atlantic convoys were not." The Campbelltown's belle, rescued before the raid and given to the town of Campbelltown, Pennsylvania, as thanks for the Destroyers for Bases program, now resides there peacefully. A reminder that sometimes the greatest weapon isn't the biggest gun or the fastest ship. Sometimes it's just courage and a timer set for 10 hours. Winston Churchill called St. Nazaire the greatest raid of all. He was right.